Okay, so on today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to draw tree branches or basic branch structures regardless of what kind of subject matter you're drawing. Now I say that because branches are the kind of forms that you may see in various different parts of nature. So obviously you're going to see them on trees, but within the human body you've got the vein structure in which branch systems kind of form, and honestly you see it throughout nature. Now I'm talking about sort of free growing branches that don't necessarily grow in a totally rigid structure. So if you're drawing something like a pine tree and you've got the main structure of the tree, the branches do kind of perform a little bit more rigidly, not like this, but not quite that regimented, but they're not organic. They don't change to the environment quite as much, and you're going to see much more regimented than the type of branches that I'm going to show you today. So one of the most important lessons when thinking about branches, especially if you want to create something that's quite kind of characterful with interesting features, is that you don't really want to do straight lines. Now a lot of people, when they're drawing a tree for example, they'll start with a structure like this and they'll just do some branches coming off it. And it's not uncommon for people to do branches like this. I see this a lot with my teaching, is that maybe then they start to introduce some swirling, smaller branches coming from this. And it's really, it kind of works as a kind of cartoony kind of tree, a very stylized tree, where you've got sort of curved branches with then more curling branches coming off it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if that's the style you're going for, but that's not really how any kind of branch would actually grow. So the kind of branch that I'm talking about is something that has a kind of almost a life and character of its own. And I'm slightly obsessed with this kind of structure. It's within my own paintings. I find that, you know, branch structures are the kind of things that keep cropping up. They're not always straightforward trees, but they're definitely kind of branch structures, and they won't necessarily perform in quite the same way that I'm going to show you on this tutorial. But I'm just demonstrating the fact that I am slightly obsessed with this type of structure where it looks like branches and trees and things sort of dividing off and growing as it will. So if you were to watch someone draw a tree branch quite successfully, you might not necessarily see all the sort of computations, the mental process involved in actually drawing it effectively. What I may basically mean by that is that it is a 3D structure, and although you may see the end product, what you don't necessarily notice when you're watching someone drawing it is the kind of the consideration of the 3D facets of this. So I'm just sketching in something pretty quickly just to get you something to actually judge what I'm saying from. So let's just say I'm working with these structures here. Now, in my mind's eye, they are changing direction constantly. So they'll be growing up, down, left, right, but there'll also be 3D depth to that as well. So for example, I'm going to try and imagine that this branch structure is kind of transparent, and we're going to create relatively regular kind of rings along that structure, so you can see the change in direction that is actually taking place. Now, this is the way that I'm perceiving it as I'm drawing it, even though it isn't necessarily something that I wouldn't do these shapes when I'm actually drawing it. So it's in my mind, but I wouldn't find it necessary to draw these because I can just kind of visualize where they would take place. After enough practice, then a lot of the mental processes are just simply that. You don't have to do the whole structure. Just like if you are used to drawing a human face, initially you'd start with the division, so you'd know the exact proportions, and you'd have to do those guidelines initially. But when you get to the point where you're a bit more confident, then these types of things you just do, you know, in a fleeting moment, you kind of tell yourself where these are without having to draw them in. But assuming that we're starting more of a beginner, I'm going to start with a sense that we're drawing these in just so we can judge where these kind of ring shapes would actually be. So I could do the dashed line. You can see that's almost looking through the transparent tree there, or the branch structure. And when we get to here, some of them you don't need to. So this is a relatively, it's not really changing forwards and backwards too much. It's a relatively side to side branch. So the actual discs and the hoop shapes that I'm drawing in here as a guide are not changing direction very dramatically. However, if I were to draw something that kind of twists as a structure back in on itself, perhaps, as some branches may well do, then we're going to have a very kind of different set, very different kind of structure that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, slightly exaggerated here. There's probably more limbs growing off this than you would actually see in real life, but it gives us something to work with nevertheless. Again, we're going to start with these kind of ring shapes, just like I did with the previous one, but they're going to move around with that form. So you've got the outer edge of that kind of ring, and then you can see it's changing direction at the sort of top here, and then it's now moved the other way. So on this is on the outer edge as you are looking at this transparent tube, and then it's going to go around and it's changed direction for this back section. When we get to sort of here, you can see it's more like this. Now, like I say, I wouldn't draw any of these guidelines when I'm actually drawing it, but that doesn't mean to say I'm not thinking of it in those terms, because I am. Now, when I come to do this one, it's going to be moving that way, and the top outer edge of our kind of cylindrical shape is going to be going that way, and the one that's in the background through the transparent tube is going to be going behind it and going that way. So you can see there's quite a lot of changes of direction here, and I could even color code it just so you get a stronger idea that the outer edge, excuse me if I get the red better, so the outer edge, put on a 6B and turn the size of that brush up a bit, is on here. Now if you use the blue to create a cooler colour, and this is going to be in the background of that loop shape, so this goes behind our kind of transparent tube, and you can see the changes of direction better, perhaps. I hope this is sort of demonstrating the point that we have lots of changes of directions of that kind of cylindrical shape. Now, if I just take it back to the basic structure as I started to begin with, and I go back to a sensible colour. When I'm actually adding shading and detail to a form like this, I don't draw those shapes as I've already explained, but I am thinking in terms of them. So I know that there's a general direction here, for example. There's a general direction here, a general direction here, and then it changes, and we're working with lines that appear to go that way, and likewise here, that way. Now, I've already drawn more lines there than I would, but you can see it's a lot less than the other demonstration that I just gave. So if I just draw the occasional one in like this now, then it's just going to help really get it clear in my mind's eye exactly the kind of direction of some of these branches. And it goes for every single branch at this point too. So it's not just for the main branches, you need to conceive and imagine this kind of process for every single branch form. It's going to be a 3D thing if you want it to successfully live in a 3D illusion environment. If you're just looking to create like a silhouette, then it's really not important. But if you look, although even then, to be honest, even when I'm doing a silhouette and it's completely flat, I can't help but imagine which branches are going in front of others, and they're kind of generally which direction they're going in. So it is all important. And now I've got that kind of in place, then I would typically start adding shadows. Now, it's really helped me understand what goes where. So this is going more dramatically in the background, so I can start adding perhaps more shadow on the under edge of some of these branch forms. I might even use that kind of general direction. In fact, I do often use that general direction for the texture. So if I've got any kind of gnarly textural elements that go cut across, they will follow that line, that general kind of curve shape. So although it's not necessarily there as a guide that is visible at the end, everything will conform to that general curve as well if you have any textural elements. So if you were drawing something like a silver birch that had sort of peeling sections of bark coming off it, they would peel off in a curve like this. And you may get a section peeling off and peeling backwards on itself, but the exposed section of texture would curve with the direction of the kind of actually cylindrical tube shape. And then once we get to here, we know that it's going to change direction from what we did earlier. When something does go further back like that, my general technique would be to knock in some mid-tones just to knock it back. So you're not getting the highlights, you're not getting the dark tone especially, but you just the middle tones, block it in, flatten it out, make it more subdued so it seems more sort of distant. And then when you're doing the more foreground elements, you're going to have more black tones, and also you're going to leave some bits white as well. So you just get that kind of contrast that will pop more and help it jump forward more. Again, I'm using some of these directional lines for the texture. And this, like I said earlier, this applies for even the smallest of branches. You can start to just suggest the direction of it. So again, this branch is slightly further back, so I'm not pressing on as much, I'm not using the real blackest of tones. I'm just flattening it out a little bit with a mid-tone. This is still quite sketchy, this is pretty rough. If I was, for example, out in the woodland and I was sketching a tree in front of me, this is the type of detail that I would go to. I wouldn't be copying every single tiny little textural element of that tree. I would be trying to get a sense of it. In fact, I did this quite a lot when I was a few years ago as a student, quite a few years ago actually, drawing out in woodland, trying to capture the forms. What I found was that if I was just doing the outlines, because that was the kind of mode that I was in at that time really, was copying every single detail. I spent a long time just doing the outlines and then didn't really understand any quick methods to really portray the shapes without drawing every minute detail. So I developed my skills a little bit at the time and really started to use the kind of guide. I exaggerated these kind of lines going around just to really, when I was looking back at it later on, just so that I could really understand the shapes and the directions of the forms that I was actually drawing. And it stuck with me, that, and actually they are suggested by the texture as you look at it. It's just, I think sometimes when you're drawing, it's knowing which features are really going to help you in describing a form, therefore are things that you need to include, and which things are less relevant. Because there's, in theory, when you're looking at something as complicated as a real tree in front of you, there's just millions of points of information that you could labour over. But actually, with drawing, you're not drawing everything, you are being quite selective, you are prioritising with any drawing which bits are the most important to convey the thing that you're drawing. You can't draw it all, there isn't simply enough time. And no real artist does. I mean, I guess some of the old masters maybe had a period of time where they were trying to make something look as photographic as possible, in the sense that they would draw every minute hair on a dog's back, for example. But I think that, really speaking, that was kind of a stage, a technical point at which people, were trying to get to the point where they could do that. But I think since this sort of invention of photography, it seems a little more redundant, really, to draw something in its absolute every single minute detail. And you'll notice this with really confident artists as they get more mature, is that they will get looser in style because they find shortcuts, shorthand ways of actually conveying the impression of something without labouring over the tiniest and tiniest of little details. Now I realise the thing I'm drawing here probably wouldn't exist in nature. You're not going to get a branch this kind of shape with two massive limbs growing off it like that, not so often anyway, which is kind of the next point that I'm coming to with drawing branches. And that is that when you are drawing a branch shape, the branches that grow from it need to be in keeping with the size and the proportions of the main structure they grow from. So what I mean by that, for example, is that a branch will, as it grows, 90% of the time or more, continue to get thinner as it goes along. There are exceptions to that. For example, if something has received a lot of kind of weathering, it may strengthen up in that area a bit like a callus would do on skin. It hardens up in that area and gets kind of stronger in that particular weathered or stressed area of the tree. But naturally, in terms of the way it grows, it will get thinner as it goes. And now that is true of everything that grows from it as well. So if you get a section here that sprouts another branch, it may start off almost as thick as the area that it's growing from, but a little bit thinner in fact, and then that again will continue to grow thinner too. So again, we reach a section here where we've got a thickness between there, and the thing that grows from it can't be any wider than that. It's usually a little bit thinner than that. Almost all the time it's going to be a little bit thinner, and then that continues to get thinner again. So as you get lower down here, you've got your branch and it gets thicker. Maybe you've got the base of the trunk and you've got a real thick section here, and that splits off into more sections. So you can see here this section is sprouted 2 extra sections, but each one of those is thinner, and it gets thinner as it goes along. Now, very often when I'm seeing people draw branches on trees, they really don't keep a sense of that at all. So they'll have a thin section, then it will get thicker and thinner, and I struggle to do it exactly. I struggle to replicate it in the exact way that I've seen my students do. It's something, once you understand it, it becomes very difficult to actually sort of defy the actual rules that should be applied. But you will get the people that draw sections where it gets thinner and then it gets thicker again. And that's really not the way that branches work. And likewise, if you're drawing something that has a large branch, you're not suddenly only going to get lots of thin branches growing from it either. That's, generally speaking, not the way it goes. And again, that's something that people make mistake with when they're drawing a tree, is they'll have an enormous sort of trunk shape, and then when they come to do the branches, the only kind of branches they have growing from it are really spindly, little, tiny, thin branches. I mean, that's not good drawing, obviously, but that's the kind of the way that people will often draw branches that come from trees, whereas in reality, they will gradually get thinner. So if you start with a base of a tree that has a trunk maybe like this, and maybe it doesn't grow straight, and maybe then it splits off at some one point, and you're going to have an area like this. So at each point, you see it's already getting thinner, and then at this point, that branch will branch off perhaps into two branches where it's kind of divided in two. This one, again, will split off, and every time it splits off, it's going to be split off with branches that are thinner, but not necessarily too thin, too spindly to begin with. And obviously, as branches keep going, they keep splitting off into an increasing amount of smaller breaks as well, and more kind of little twigs and things like that. It's not to say you won't get little twigs that grow from a bigger section. You will get initially little points of growth from quite a big trunk, but in a general sense, this is the way that it would work. So you'd have quite a big trunk, it would split off, get thinner as it goes along, until we get to the very end and we've got the absolute thinnest sort of branches at the end, and then that's the point at which you would get foliage growing from the tiniest branches, which is largely why we'd see the most of the foliage on the kind of outer kind of skin of the branches, really. Anyway, I hope that's been useful. Like I say, I've done lots of different kind of landscape tutorials, I've done different tree tutorials, and I intend to do lots of kind of basic drawing instruction tutorials as well. So please do subscribe, check out my playlists and other videos, and I shall catch you back here very soon.